I'm Albert Evans, and this is Show Talk. This is the second of two show talks taking us inside the mind of Stephen Sondheim, the composer-lyricist of Into the Woods, and Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, the first two productions of 2023 at the Fifth Avenue Theater. In this talk, we'll take a look at Sweeney Todd. Many of you are already familiar with the story of revenge and murder, subtitled A Musical Thriller. It's one of Sondheim's most acclaimed and often produced musicals. But before we dig into Sweeney, let's quickly recap the key events of Sondheim's life. Sondheim was born in 1930 and spent his early years in Manhattan, the son of a mostly absent father and a narcissistic, often cruel mother. When his parents divorced, he went to live with his mother in the Pennsylvania countryside, where he met the neighboring family of Oscar Hammerstein, the Broadway lyricist. Oscar became a sort of surrogate father. He supplied the attention young Stephen craved, and when asked, tutored the boy in the craft of musical theater. In the 1960s, he wrote both lyrics and music for a big hit, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and a quick flop, Anyone Can Whistle. Sondheim's mature voice emerged in the 1970s with an astonishing string of masterpieces: Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, Pacific Overtures, and the subject of this talk, Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. For some of you, the Fifth Avenue production may be your first encounter with Sweeney, so I'll try not to give too much away in what follows. And that won't be easy, since I've seen many productions of the show, starting with its astonishing Broadway premiere in 1979, 44 years ago. Since then, the demon barber and his adoring accomplice, Mrs. Lovett, have frightened and delighted audiences in venues large and small, from grand opera houses to intimate regional, college, and amateur productions. There was even one in a working pie shop. Friends of mine have acted in Sweeney Todd, directed it, designed it, and played in the orchestra. Over the years, we've thoroughly debated and dissected it, parodied it, and worn its costumes on Halloween. Yet there's always something new to be discovered. The story of Sweeney Todd is not, as we might assume, an urban legend of old London. It was a literary creation of uncertain authorship, which first appeared in 1846 as a weekly serial in a British publication called The People's Periodical and Family Magazine. Now, the magazine's cozy name is deceptive. The People's Periodical was one of dozens of penny dreadfuls published at the time, magazines filled with blood-curdling tales of crime and horror, and marketed to a mostly male, mostly young, and mostly lower-class readership. Printed on cheap paper and sold for a penny, penny dreadfuls were unlikely to be found in any family library outside the dark slums of London. The Sweeney story's original title was The String of Pearls, referring to a clue that leads to the villain's exposure. I read it recently, and I was surprised to find that it was really rather well written, probably the work of a down-and-out novelist with higher goals. Serial publication in magazines was very common in the 19th century. Charles Dickens wrote most of his novels as serials, often staying just ahead of the weekly deadlines. Even before The String of Pearls published its final chapters, it was adapted for the stage by other hands. Now, of course, the stage authors had no idea how the magazine story would end, so they simply made up their own final scenes. They also changed the title to Sweeney Todd, which has a nice, sinister ring. The central characters of Sweeney Todd have remained fixed ever since The String of Pearls. There's Sweeney Todd himself, the murderous barber who swings a lethal straight razor. Now, Sweeney has one problem: how to dispose of the corpses that are piling up in his basement. Enter his friend and accomplice, Mrs. Lovett, a baker of dubious meat pies who proposes a solution. Also in Sweeney's shop is Toby Ragg, Sweeney's naive young assistant. Other characters include Antony, a love-starved sailor who is infatuated with Joanna, an innocent 18-year-old maiden, and Sweeney's nemesis, a very wicked clergyman who in later tellings becomes a judge. Now, why did this story resonate so strongly with the British public in the mid-1800s? Let's take a look at some of its themes. And we might as well start with the most disturbing of these, cannibalism. Involuntary cannibalism, to be sure. The customers who gobble down Mrs. Lovett's meat pies have no idea that they are devouring their fellow citizens. The String of Pearls story is set in 1785, but the grim world it pictures reflects its publication in the 1840s. England was the first country to become industrialized. As a result, it was experiencing a mass internal migration. By the millions, folks were abandoning their family farms and rural villages and moving to huge commercial centers like London and smoky factory towns like Birmingham, where they were surrounded by strangers who sold them everything they ate and drank, whereas in the country they had relied on themselves and their friends and neighbors for all of life's necessity. So you knew what you were buying. In the city, the temptation for vendors to cheat the newcomers was too great. Flour was adulterated with chalk and alum. Ground pepper was often whatever was swept up from the floor of pepper warehouses. And meat, in particular, could easily be mislabeled. My grandmother taught me an old song about a sausage maker who invented a wonderful machine for grinding unorthodox meats. Maybe some of you know it. The refrain went, "Oh, Mr. Johnny Rebeck, how could you be so mean? I told you you'd be sorry for inventing that machine. Now all the neighbors' cats and dogs will never more be seen. They'll all be ground to sausages by Johnny Rebeck's machine." In Sweeney Todd, Mrs. Lovett alludes to this enterprising practice in this lyric.
"Wouldn't do in my shop. Just the thought of it's enough to make you sick. And I'm telling you, them pussycats is quick."
Pure food laws were introduced in Parliament but regularly stalled. It wasn't until 1875 that strict inspection measures were finally passed and enforced. On a metaphorical level, the inhuman cities themselves could be seen as cannibals, luring Britons into their gaping maws and swallowing them whole. Or, as Sweeney and Lovett put it,
"The history of the world, my sweets,
Oh, Mr. Todd, ooh, Mr. Todd, what does it tell?
is who gets eaten and who gets to eat."
And Mr. Todd, too, Mr. Todd, who gets to sell?
who gets eaten and who gets to eat. As the Industrial Revolution spread worldwide, so did the devouring city. At the height of the British Empire, it held sway over 23% of the world's population, swallowing countries, citizens, and economies whole. The sun never sets on the British Empire was a fact, not an exaggeration. The theme of cannibalism is found in humanity's most ancient myths. Cronus, the father of Zeus, is said to have eaten his children to prevent them from overthrowing him. Zeus is saved from this fate by his mother Rhea, and when he is grown, he gives his father a drug which makes him vomit up all his sons and daughters alive. In more recent times, the Brothers Grimm collected German folk tales that center on cannibalism, like the Robber Bridegroom, the Juniper Tree, and that perennial kiddie favorite, Hansel and Gretel. The Sweeney story was little known in America, but remained wildly popular with the British public well into the 20th century. It was so influential that men actually grew reluctant to be shaved by professionals until the barbers changed their profession to hairdresser to avoid the Sweeney connection. And for a time, sales of meat pies dropped significantly. For the first 125 years, Sweeney Todd was presented as a maniacal thief who gleefully cuts the throats of his customers and robs them of their valuables. He preys on traveling businessmen and also sailors returning home to their sweethearts with costly gifts. His barber shop was on Fleet Street, which runs parallel to the docks of the Thames. It was originally the site of the Fleet River, which washed all the garbage and human waste of the city into the Thames. But in the late 18th century, the river was paved over, still performing its smelly duties, but now underground. So Sweeney's deadly shop was conveniently located for sailors to be polished up before returning home. Instead, many of them were polished off by our friend Sweeney, and their corpses are taken away by Mrs. Lovett for her delectable pies. The barber has no motive other than greed and the thrill of the kill. Sweeney held the stage in dozens of plays and silent film adaptations, usually called Sweeney Todd, or sometimes The Demon Barber, or sometimes both. In 1924, a man named Carter Slaughter, that's his real name, a blood and thunder melodrama actor, changed his first name to Todd, T-O-D, and as Todd Slaughter played the Demon Barber for 3 decades and over 2,000 performances. In the 1930s, he filmed it and many of his other melodrama roles, immortalizing his over-the-top style for us to enjoy. These movies have been badly damaged over the years, but let's take a brief look at one of them. Here is Todd Slaughter as Sweeney, terrifying his new shop assistant, the orphan Toby Ragg.
Ah, Mr. Beadle, so you've brought me another apprentice. And a nice little boy, too.
The city master says this is the last boy he's going to send you. You've had 7, and they've all disappeared.
Boys will be boys.
But you get a guinea from the parish funds for each boy. 7 guineas in 7 weeks.
And this is the 8th.
And the last.
Come here, Tobias. Are you afraid of me, Tobias?
No, not really, sir.
Take care you don't give me cause to make you afraid of me.
I'll try to do my best, sir.
That's a good boy. The first duty of a barber's boy is to keep a still tongue in his head.
Yes, sir.
I knew a nice little barber's boy once who had his tongue cut out for letting it wag too much.
I won't talk, sir.
No. And if any of my customers should give you a penny, what would you do with it, Tobias?
I don't know, sir.
You'll give all the pennies to me and I'll keep them for you, till you become a rich, rich man. You've a soft heart, Mr. Todd. Tender as a chicken, sir. It's my one weakness. Now see the welcome Sweeney Todd gives to gentlemen who return from foreign parts.
Now, why was Stephen Sondheim, a sophisticated composer at the peak of his career, drawn to this horrifying story? Well, as a teenager in the 1940s, Sondheim was a devoted movie fan. He especially liked the film noir melodramas of the post-war years with their sinister, brooding scores. And his very favorite was a film called Hangover Square, a tale about a promising pianist-composer in Edwardian London who commits brutal murders during amnesia-produced blackouts. The film's music was by the brilliant modernist composer Bernard Herrmann, whose career ranged from Citizen Kane through Taxi Driver, including several memorable scores for Hitchcock movies like Vertigo, North by Northwest, and Psycho. Here is the title music of Hangover Square. Herman's signature sound was an unsettling combination of pitches that he used so often it became known as the Bernard Herrmann chord. This is a minor chord with a dissonant major seventh. That B unsettles the harmony, makes it harsh. Of course, it can be played in any key. Here it is in the overture to Psycho. Or the pitches can be broken up into an eerie melody, as in the main theme from Hitchcock's Vertigo. You'll hear Herrmann's chord and its derivatives many, many times in Sweeney Todd. In the early 1970s, Christopher Bond, a young British playwright, wrote a revisionist version of Sweeney Todd, the first to give the barber a revenge motive for his killings. In Chris Bond's story, a young barber, Benjamin Barker, runs afoul of the wicked Judge Turpin. Turpin lusts after Barker's wife, has her abducted, brutally violates her, and on a trumped-up charge sentences the powerless barber to prison in Australia. And that's just the backstory. 15 years later, the wife has poisoned herself, and lustful Judge Turpin has adopted her young and desirable daughter, now imprisoned in his house. Well, Benjamin Barker escapes from Australia under the name of Sweeney Todd. He makes his way back to London, determined to take bloody revenge on the judge and the system that allowed him to commit his crimes. In Chris Bond's play, Sweeney is still creepy, but his rage against the corrupt justice system is understandable, at least emotionally. Sweeney sets up in his old barber shop, located conveniently above Mrs. Lovett's meat pie shop, and the story begins. On a trip to London, Stephen Sondheim saw Bond's play and right away thought it would make an excellent musical thriller. At first he planned to write it all himself, music, lyrics, and script. That proved to be too many hats to wear, even for a genius like Sondheim, so he turned the script duties over to Hugh Wheeler, his collaborator on A Little Night Music, and added producer-director Hal Prince to the creative team. Sondheim had always wondered if a stage musical could be truly frightening, the way a movie could. This was his chance to find out. Recalling those dark suspense films he had loved as a teenager, he realized that one important ingredient was the nearly continuous, unsettling music, under dialogue, under car rides, under walks down dark alleys, even under an action as simple as drinking a glass of milk or taking a pill. And the master of that sort of scoring was Bernard Herrmann. That's why Sweeney Todd is almost completely underscored, never letting the tension drop. And as I said, Herrmann's disturbing chord is never missing for long. There is a spooky Gregorian chant that plays a major role in the score, the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath. It was part of the Roman Rite funeral mass for centuries until the Second Vatican Council struck it out in 1969 for overemphasizing judgment and despair. The few notes of the Dies Irae have an uncanny ability to strike fear into the hearts of sinners and saints alike. My favorite is by Berlioz in the Witches' Sabbath movement of his Symphonie Fantastique. You've heard the Dies Irae in literally hundreds of movies and TV shows. Here are just a few examples. The Shining, It's a Wonderful Life,
Help me, Clarence! Get me back! Get me back! I don't care what happens to me! Get me back to my wife and kids!
Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Big Trouble in Little China,
到中国银行。Mr. Chen Xinrong, please come to CAS information.
Star Wars, and even The Nightmare Before Christmas.
Making Christmas is so fine.
It's ours this time, and won't the children be surprised?
The Dies Irae is a constant presence in Sweeney. In fact, it anchors the very first song. Sondheim loved classical music, but was not a fan of most operas. He wanted to be drawn into the plot, and in his view, classical singers often value the unbroken musical line above lyric intelligibility. High voices especially can be hard to understand. But the Sweeney score is musically quite challenging, with unusual harmonies, like that Herman chord, and tricky melodies that are hard to master without at least some formal training. The joy of this score is in its abundance. A composer could approach Sweeney Todd in two ways. One is to lean into the violence, scare the audience through their ears. In fact, a Canadian rock band called Sweeney Todd took this approach in 1975, 4 years before the musical. Their album didn't aim to tell a coherent narrative, but many of its songs are named after the story's characters, incidents, and props, like A String of Pearls, A Little Bit Off the Top, Toby or Not Toby, and In the Madhouse. Here's a little cut called Bakehouse Boy. You may want to put your earplugs in. By the way, an alumnus of the band was Bryan Adams, who became one of the best-selling music artists of all time. So you never know. The other musical approach is the one that Sondheim took, to seduce the audience with songs and underscoring that are intensely beautiful, disturbingly seductive, and insanely well-crafted. His Sweeney score may actually be his most lyrical music, jump scares aside. Listen to this beautiful melody, Pretty Women.
Pretty women, fascinating, sipping coffee, dancing. Pretty women are a wonder. Pretty women sitting in the window, standing on the stair. Something in them cheers the air.
This is sung by Sweeney to put a customer at ease before cutting his throat. Beauty and horror seamlessly combined. Several other attractive songs are used to mask bloody deeds, but no more spoilers. Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, is subtitled A Musical Thriller. And that's exactly right. It's a show that employs music of all sorts to heighten the fright. When we are entertained by villains, we are, for the moment, complicit. A technique mastered by Alfred Hitchcock on the screen and on stage in Sweeney Todd by the master of musical suspense, Stephen Sondheim. Thanks for listening. I'll see you at the 5th.